So obviously the stance system is a huge addition to Jedi Survivor. It's a massive part of the game, and although we have known about these stances for quite a while, both in terms of what they are and how they work, now that I've actually played the game, I can finally give some sort of in-depth tips on when is the best time to use each of them. At the end of the day, you can just use any stance you want against any enemy and you can still do well. They are all viable, but each of them do really have strengths and weaknesses, and they definitely have, I guess, different enemy types that they each suit more than the other ones. So that is what we're going to be going through today. This video is going to be spoiler free from story elements. There won't be anything to do with the story, but just keep in mind there may be like certain parts of the maps, for example, that you haven't seen yet, so just keep that in mind. That is the final warning for spoilers. Starting off with the single blade, because it's obviously just the basic one and it is the first one you have. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really think this is worth using, purely because it was already in the first game. Pretty much used it for that entire game, and realistically it is just the same in this game as it was in that game. Plus it is just like the jack of all trades but master of none, so it can do fairly well against any enemy type, but it doesn't really have like a main strength to it. So like I said, I personally almost didn't use this the whole game. The only times I did use it was to literally just try and get some gameplay with it. If you do want to use it for immersion, then that's obviously completely understandable. It is like the most iconic of any of the stances, just a regular lightsaber, but if you don't really care about the immersion factor, I honestly just wouldn't even bother using the single blade stance. Not that it's bad by any means, it's just that the rest are way cooler. Now moving on to the double blade, for me personally this is easily my all-around favorite of the stances in the game. It is a really good stance for sort of like crowd control situation. So pretty much any time that there's a bunch of enemies around you, anything more than say 3 enemies, this is definitely the stance you want to be using, especially when that is in like tight spaces. If you're in a really close quarters area and there's say 5 battle droids, definitely try and use this stance because it deals damage in a really wide area around you, and it also has some really solid defense as well. Now touching on the defense, it is definitely the best for defending against blasters. Just like it did in Fallen Order, if you get the perfect parry on the first blaster bolt, it will perfect parry every single blaster bolt that enemy fires, and depending if there are other enemies around that are shooting blasters as well, you can literally just hit every single blaster bolt directly back at each enemy that is shooting at you. So not only is it good for crowd control, but if you're up against a bunch of enemies that have blasters, this is the one you want to use. It is absolutely by far the best in terms of defending against blasters, and I would argue this even has better range on it than the actual blaster stance itself, because that does actually have a limited amount of ammo. This one essentially doesn't. You can pretty much just block every blaster bolt that comes at you. Obviously you do have your blocking stamina, but pretty much you will have killed every enemy by the time you're actually out of stamina. Overall, I would personally say that the double blade is the, I guess, best stance in the game. None of them are necessarily the single best, but I think this is definitely the all-around easiest to use in terms of just being really good for most situations in the game. Moving on to the dual wield stance. This one is really fun to use. It's probably not quite as good in my opinion as the double blade stance, but it is also arguably more enjoyable to play. It is very good in close quarters, especially against other melee enemies. It has a really fast swing speed, so you can kind of get in and out really fast, deal a bunch of quick damage. Now the downside to that is that you are pretty much a glass cannon, so the parries work really well if you can land a perfect parry. Because of how fast your swing speed is, you can kind of perfectly parry them and they will obviously be defenseless, and you can get a few hits in there before they actually bring their guard up again. But also in saying that, it is actually harder to perfect parry with dual wield stance. The timing has to be a lot more accurate. So on something like Grandmaster, for example, this will definitely be a lot harder to use, simply because you have to be really good with your parry timing. Depending on the type of enemy, for example, a lot of enemies who are maybe bigger, any of the like large creature type enemies, it can be a little bit tricky sometimes to use this stance against them. But when it comes to regular infantry, especially like melee infantry, this is definitely a really solid stance to use, and for me personally it's probably one of the more enjoyable ones in the game. Now moving on, we have the blaster stance, and this is a really good addition to the game in my opinion. It is really good for adding range. Obviously that is the whole point of having a blaster. You don't have to be so close to the enemies, which just gives you a lot more like freedom in terms of you don't have to always be panicking, you don't have to be constantly dodging, trying to get away. You can literally just be like walking backwards and the enemies are coming at you while you're still dealing damage to them. So it's really good for adding range. In my opinion, this will be probably the easiest stance to use against most bosses in the game, because obviously again you don't have to get right up close and personal to that boss. So especially any of the bosses who have like one hit potential, if you're using like the dual wield stance, you have to be very close to them to deal any damage, and that obviously comes at the risk of if they hit you, you're going to die. So this really removes that. You can kind of stand back in those boss battles and get a little bit more distance. And I think a lot of people are going to lean on this one when it comes to the tough boss fights. What I will say on the flip side though, it does struggle a fair bit in close quarters. The swing time, or the swing speed I should say, is pretty damn slow. You definitely don't want to be like caught with this if there's a bunch of enemies pushing towards you. For example, the situation I explained with the double blade, where if you're in close quarters with a bunch of enemies, that is really good. That exact situation with this stance, you are pretty much going to die. So it's a really good stance, but I would definitely pair this one with the double blade or the dual wield, just to make sure you kind of have a backup when you are getting pressed by a bunch of enemies. Now, last but definitely not least, we have the CROSSGUARD stance. I'm not going to lie, I had pretty much no care for this leading into the game. In any other game that I play when it comes to like melee combat type games, I'm never really a fan of like the broadsword or the great sword or whatever they're called in each game. They've never really appealed to me, so I didn't really care about this stance that much going into it. It looked cool obviously with the CROSSGUARD on it, but I didn't think I'd really enjoy it. Now, despite that, I think this is potentially my favorite in the game. Like I said, double blade is probably my favorite because it's really fluid and really fun to use. But this one, man, when you pull off some really good bits of gameplay with this, it's probably more enjoyable than any stance in the game, I think. And I do think this will be probably the most slept on stance in the whole game, because I think a lot of people are probably having that same thought process as me, where it's a bit slow and clunky, so I don't really want to use it. Trust me, give this one a chance. It is so much fun to use. Now, the thing with this one too is that not only is it fun, it is actually really, really good, especially against anyone who pretty much isn't quick. So we all know there's certain types of enemies, for example, the purge troopers who have like the dual wield batons, they attack you super quick, they're super agile, and I'm not gonna lie, if you use the CROSSGUARD against them, you'll probably get murked. But on the flip side, against maybe those larger creatures, even a lot of the boss fights, in fact pretty much all of the main bosses, this is the one that I actually ended up leaning on. I tried to really not use the blaster because I feel like it is a little bit easy, but this was actually one that I thought is relatively hard to use still, because it does have a lot of risk to it. But man, if you can pull off those dodges and then sneak in a few quick hits, this thing is absolutely mental. So definitely give it a try against any of the like bigger bosses. For example, Ravis, this one's really fun to use against him. I do also think that of any of the stances in this game, maybe outside of the dual wield stance, this probably has the highest ceiling in the game. So if you're really, really good at the game, this one probably allows you to be the best out of any of the stances. But obviously with that high skill ceiling means that you do have to be good with it. So if you're not very good with it, it'll have the opposite effect. It's going to make it very hard for you to use. So yeah, just be sure to keep that in mind. But I think any of you that are confident and comfortable playing a game like this, you've played a lot of combat games in the past, you may actually do a lot better with this one than you probably think you will. But that is it for all 5 of the stances in the game and essentially when they are best to use. Hopefully that gives you guys a good idea of when to use each stance. I do still recommend just trying it out and trying to use all of them outside of, like I said, maybe the single blade. That's the one you can definitely miss out on and it's not going to really affect your gameplay. And so although I've given you guys some ideas, definitely still try them all out on each type of enemy and just get a feel for how they actually play. The other thing I'll say is that if you are getting stuck on certain bosses or even just certain areas of the game, even if you have a clear favorite out of these stances and you really feel comfortable using it to the point where you feel uncomfortable using any of the other stances, don't let that hinder you. Definitely try and change up your stances if you are getting stuck. That's actually how I found out that I love the CROSSGUARD, because I was just using the double blade and the dual wield. I could not get past a few bosses and I pulled out the CROSSGUARD and absolutely murked them. So be open-minded with the stances, definitely give them all a try and you guys may find a brand new favorite. With that being said though, guys, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day and may the force be with you always.